Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So today we'll be reflecting on this final frenetic day of the election and looking back at the whole of the campaign. But let's begin with a look at the front pages. Most are still understandably focused on the aftermath of the London terror attack at the weekend. But some have a more political angle, and the common theme? Security. The Sun, picking up a story from blogger Guido Fawkes, says Jeremy Corbyn gave a speech at a demonstration attended by members of an outlawed Islamicist group, Al-Muhajirun. Some said to be dressed as suicide bombers and chanting anti-Semitic slogans. Labour says it was a public event and Mr Corbyn was not responsible for who attended. The Guardian's headline is May threatens to dismantle human rights laws in wake of terror attacks, following on from a speech by the Prime Minister last night when she set out a series of new counter-terrorism positions. The Financial Times leads on that story too. It says Theresa May is targeting Labour heartlands and is ramping up the anti-terror rhetoric in response to criticism of her handling of the terror threat. And the Daily Mail's headline is Apologists for Terror, with pictures of Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell and Diane Abbott. The paper, of course, is no fan of Labour's top team and says that they've spent their whole careers cozying up to those who hate our country. Well, let's take a look at that announcement from the Prime Minister. She's talking about tightening restrictions on suspects, making it easier to expel foreign offenders and, if necessary, opting out of some human rights laws, which she says are used to block efforts to deport terrorists. Here's the Prime Minister, and then we'll hear from the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, responding.
I mean longer prison sentences for those convicted of terrorist offences. I mean making it easier for the authorities to deport foreign terrorist suspects back to their own countries. And I mean doing more to restrict the freedom and movements of terrorist suspects when we have enough evidence to know they are a threat, but not enough evidence to prosecute them in full in court. And if our human rights laws stop us from doing it, we'll change the laws so we can do it.
We won't defeat terrorism by ripping up our basic rights and our democracy. We defeat terrorism by our communities, by our vigilance and by police action to isolate and detain those that would wish us harm. Obviously, if somebody is a foreign national resident in Britain who is committing crimes, then clearly the law is there to take its course now. The issue is police numbers and police security.
Well, that was the Prime Minister, then the Leader of the Opposition, Ed Vaizey, 3 weeks ago when Mrs May launched the Tory manifesto. It guaranteed the Human Rights Act would continue to apply and that we'd remain subject to the European Court of Human Rights. Is that commitment still valid?
As far as I'm aware, it's still valid, and there are plenty of people in the Conservative Party who support the Human Rights Act and support our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights. And I think if you read what she said yesterday, and I've seen the quote, it says, if there's an if there, so it's not a policy.
I'll just read it so our viewers know. If our human rights laws get in the way of doing it, we will change the law so we can. But that's not what she said in the manifesto.
No, but what she said in the manifesto is we'll remain signatories to the European Convention and we'll have a Human Rights Act. But as you know, France, for example, you can have a derogation. You can opt out of bits of the European Convention if you feel
so
it's
necessary.
So
is that a possibility?
France did that after the terrorist attacks. Well, I'm not a Home Office Minister and I'm not privy to the Prime Minister's thinking, but logically it would be a possibility for the UK, if it felt it necessary, as other countries have done, as Ireland did during the Troubles, to derogate from the European Convention if they felt it was necessary.
I mean, she says
there will be a whole range of things potentially that could be looked at.
But she says if our human rights laws get in the way, we'll change the law. How do you change the human rights of ECHR?
Well, as I say, you can have a derogation.
That's not a change, that's a temporary move.
An emergency, and we have a human rights...
How do you change it?
You have a Human Rights Act that you can potentially amend, I assume. But I think
she said in the manifesto, we will not repeal or replace.
I mean, I think the interesting point about what she's talking about...
Another U-turn,
the issues that have arrived at... Well, we can talk about process or we can talk about the substance of what people are having to face up to. And
We're talking about someone who was Home Secretary for 6 years.
Two things come to me from these terrible events that happened in Manchester and London. One is this grey area where you know people are extremists, but they haven't committed a crime. And it's quite clear the guy who was in the Channel 4 documentary was on the extremes, but the authorities felt they couldn't move because he hadn't actually committed a crime. And I think the Prime Minister in that clip you showed made it very explicit that that is clearly an area of concern for her. How do you deal with these people who go right up to the edge of breaking the law, who the authorities, common sense dictates that they are a potential
So why
risk,
did you soften the control orders? Why did you soften the control orders?
The control orders were consistently being struck down by the courts, so we had to.
So why didn't you change the law to make sure the courts couldn't do that?
Well, we did. We brought in what are known as TPIMs.
No, but these were much softer.
Well, we wanted to make sure they weren't consistently struck down. There's no point having a very tough law that the courts keep knocking back. It's better to have a law that is workable and the courts will accept, and that's what we did.
Was it a mistake to scrap these control orders?
No, as I say, I think we didn't scrap the concept of control orders. You can still
pretty much did.
You can still put controls on people who you think are a danger to the public, and you can use it through this new process. It was necessary because the courts kept overturning it.
So how many of these new, not-so-tough control orders have you had?
It's turning into the traditional Viva on the daily politics, but I think about 100.
What's a Viva?
A Viva is where you test my knowledge. A pub quiz is probably more...
a pub rather than an Oxbridge thing, rather than a pub quiz.
Probably about 100.
Well, it's nothing like 100. But let's not go there. What about detention now? It looks like they're having watered down the control orders, having opposed Mr. Blair when he wanted a longer time to be able to detain suspects. She now looks like she wants more detention as well.
Well, if you remember, Blair
28 days is
put in a proposal for 42 days. Actually, Parliament at the time, when we were in opposition, compromised on 28 days, and then in coalition, we had coalition partners, it was reduced to 14 days. I think.
So you played coalition politics rather than look after the security of the country.
Partners, and there were give and take on both sides about what people thought was appropriate.
Let me have one final question before I then move on to Labour on this. Why would longer prison sentences, as Mrs. May has called for, why would it deter those, as in Westminster, Manchester and London Bridge, who are on a suicide mission?
Well, I think what people are talking about is a whole range of measures that can combat what is clearly a growing and significant threat.
But longer prison sentences would make no difference to the people who carried out these 3 attacks, would it?
Have made it, well, it may be, for example, that if you were able, for example, to look at how you could catch people before they committed these horrific crimes, if you can extend the opportunities to prosecute them, and you can put them away for longer, that will keep the public safer. There must be, I'm sure there are dozens or hundreds of people in prison now who are due to be released, where the public would think, well, actually, that person could still potentially pose a threat. We wish they had been given a longer prison sentence. So I think it's possible, it's perfectly possible to look at a whole range of different measures to combat terrorism.
You want to respond to that? Then I've got some questions for you.
Look, I was in Belmarsh prison just a few weeks ago with some men there that are there because of terrorism, and these are seriously bad people. They need to be kept under house arrest. They need to be permanently tagged. You need to control who they can speak to and liaise with in the course of the day.
Which was the original control orders.
And that was watered down, Ed.
Would you like to bring back the original control orders?
I'm for it. These are bad people, and they need to be controlled.
But David,
if you haven't got the evidence to bring...
You do accept that control orders were consistently overturned by the courts.
Is in coalition,
it wasn't just a unilateral decision.
In coalition with the Liberal Democrats, you watered it down. That's what happened.
Let me ask you. Let me ask you this, David Lammy.
Control orders watered out, overturned by the courts.
I want to ask Mr. Lammy this, because interesting, you say you would like to go back to the tougher control orders. I understand it's not. But has your leader, has Mr. Corbyn ever voted for any toughening of the anti-terrorist laws?
He hasn't.
Never?
No.
Does that make you uneasy?
Well, he wasn't leading the Labour Party at the time. He was speaking from the backbenches. And you will find...
Does that matter? He's the man who could be our next Prime Minister. And indeed, he boasted in 2011, quote, "I've been involved in opposing anti-terror legislation ever since I first went into Parliament in 1983.
Theresa May voted against same-sex legislation. She has
that's a
voted.
non-sequitur.
She has no.
Let's stick to the anti-terror legislation.
The point is, Andrew, of course you can go back in a parliamentary career of 30 years.
Well, he
and
never voted once.
And find things in a backbencher's record
No,
that do not stand.
But
when
he
he's
didn't
leader.
vote once.
I haven't denied that. I've answered your question.
So
no, he hasn't.
why would we
would he
then
vote for them
trust the security of this country to someone who has opposed every effort to toughen up our anti-terror legislation?
That is a decision for the electorate tomorrow.
I know, but what's
they
the
will
answer to my
also be
question?
judging Jeremy Corbyn on the basis of what he is saying today. And what he's saying today is that it is the Conservatives that cut the police under Theresa May. It is the Conservatives that watered down the control orders. It is the Conservatives that watered down the prevent agenda. That is the government we've had, and that is what they stand
at a
on.
time when we're probably more dependent on the security services than ever before? Who is it that a couple of years ago wanted to abolish MI5?
I'm not aware of that one.
John McDonnell, the number 2 in the Labour Party.
I am so unaware.
We are
I'm
never.
looking
Well, he
forward to
signed.
hearing a quote,
He signed
but
a document,
I know
and indeed, there's a
nothing about
picture of him holding this document. He wanted to abolish MI5. So you've got a leader who has never supported any toughening of the anti-terrorism situation, and a number 2 shadow chancellor who wanted to abolish MI5.
Well, you're putting that to me. I've never heard it before. I assume if he did want to do it, he wanted to replace it with something else.
Well, no, because he also wanted to abolish armed police as well.
Individuals were on the backbenches for years.
But does that
They're going to be in
doesn't
Downing
matter.
Street
No,
if they win the
they're
election.
now subject to collective responsibility. This is not in the Labour manifesto. It's not in the Labour manifesto.
Can I pick up just on collective responsibility?
Briefly, because I've got one final question.
You're able to sit here and say to Andrew, you know, the Tories are weak and I want tough control orders. Your Brexit Secretary, Shadow Brexit Secretary, Keir Starmer, has been touring the studios this morning saying that Theresa May is wrong to question the Human Rights Act. Yet you're here saying you're going to bring in tough terror laws. Nobody believes a word of it because Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell have been sympathetic to terrorist groups for the last 30 years.
That's because of consistent U-turn. She U-turned on national insurance, she's U-turned on the dementia tax, and now she's U-turned on the human...
Yeah, but
how can you trust someone who U-turned
We're
so
talking
many times
about
in the
security.
Hold on.
We're talking about security, and we're talking about the security of the nation.
Very much so.
And we're talking about lives, and we're talking about an election campaign which has seen 2 terrorist attacks during the campaign itself. Is it a disadvantage that your leader seems to be addressing lots of meetings over the years of people who are extremists, Islamists, anti-Semites, homophobes, misogynists, and he's addressed the various people. I mean, this latest one we've got out, there's a group in the audience shouting, "Gas the Jews, gas Tel Aviv," and he's addressing that group. Does that not concern you?
I find that...
Gas Tel Aviv.
I find that deeply offensive. Any suggestion of gassing Tel Aviv or anything that is about attacking, our friends in Israel, I think that is awful. But what I would say is that on a programme like this, and at the end of the election, no offence, Andrew, you have spent the last few minutes on the past. And here
How else do we judge you? How else can I judge you?
I suspect the manifesto...
I have to judge you by your record.
The manifesto and going forward. The Conservative record is a record in government, cutting police, watering down control orders, and ending the prevent agenda. That's the record.
All right.
And you're talking about backbench in the past.
All right, we'll leave it there. I take your point.
Do the authorities have the powers they need to tackle extremism? It would appear that Theresa May, a former Home Secretary, now thinks they do not. At a rally tonight, she indicated she would be prepared to change some human rights laws to bear down harder on the terror threat.
I mean, making it easier for the authorities to deport foreign terrorist suspects back to their own country. And I mean doing more to restrict the freedom and movements of terrorist suspects when we have enough evidence to know they are a threat, but not enough evidence to prosecute them in full in court. And if our human rights laws stop us from doing it, we'll change the laws so we can do it.
Well, we did ask to speak to the government tonight, but no one was available. Joining me now for Labour, Shami Chakrabarti, the Shadow Attorney General, and Dominic Grieve, the former Conservative Attorney General and Chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee. Good evening to both of you. Shami Chakrabarti, you could be Attorney General in 2 days' time if the authorities came to you and said, actually, we do need to make an alteration to the human rights law so that we can actually either exclude more easily or crack down on them. Would you deny it?
Our commitment is to dealing with terror suspects within the rule of law, including within the human rights values that Theresa...
the former Home Secretary doesn't think that actually...
Well, it's interesting. Firstly, this is a sort of familiar knee-jerk of Theresa May that we've heard before. A few years ago, she was talking about cats and so on. And again, she's gone for this default, that's a sort of anti-human rights dog whistle, whereas actually... A few days earlier, when she was standing in Downing Street, she said the terrorists are against human rights and we are going to protect our liberal society. So there's no detail from Theresa May this evening, but I'm disappointed.
But you're confident that the Human Rights Act, as it stands right now, is sufficient to the task? There's nothing in terms of balance of...
We will always listen to whatever the security agencies say that they need, but we are confident that we can provide any new powers that are truly necessary and proportionate within the human rights framework and within the rule of law.
Clearly something is not working. You agree, surely, the atmosphere has changed. These 2 terror attacks in 2 weeks, preceded by Westminster. There is a different atmosphere, a different climate. And people want to know that everything in the government's armoury is being used. Perhaps the armoury isn't right.
We are concerned about the armoury, and our biggest concern, as you will have heard, is about resources. Everything that I've heard from your clips this evening and everything that I've heard from the agency themselves in recent weeks suggests that cuts, for example, in the number of police officers, cuts to the Borders Agency, austerity is a potential problem, and we are committed to making that the priority.
But you have a situation now where you've heard Lord Carlisle say tonight that actually control orders are what we need back. You control orders.
Lord Carlisle and I have debated control orders on your programme over the years, and we have disagreed. If there is a need for any new powers to monitor suspects who are not yet able to be charged, we're convinced that that could be dealt with within the criminal justice system and not as an extra justice system measure like control orders. But we have said, Jeremy Corbyn has said even this evening, that he will look at the law, but the primary focus that we and the commitment that we are making is to resources.
If you have an extremist in your midst, you know, for example, someone like Chowdhury Butt is in your midst, but there isn't enough to prosecute him, but actually you want to detain him, restrain him in some way, and that you don't have the powers to do so just now, but keeping him off the streets is the main thing to do, you would look at new law.
We will always keep the law under review, but at the moment we are convinced that with additional resources we can deal with these people within the rule of law.
Is Shami Chakrabarti right? There's no need for any movement on the Human Rights Act?
Certainly the current architecture we have of human rights allows for derogation. So there is no difficulty derogating if you can show that it's necessary and proportionate to do so. And the Prime Minister is therefore absolutely right when she says that within the structures of our ECHR obligations, we could, if necessary, for example, if we felt it was vital, detain people without trial. Whether it would be a good thing to do it or not is another matter, but the powers do exist to allow that to happen.
So she's actually not saying anything new tonight at all. I mean, that's not the way she's putting it out there.
That wasn't what I understood her to say. I was present when she spoke. I understood her to say that she was going to wish to review the legal framework that we had and see whether there were areas in which it could be improved. Now, that's perfectly compatible with our human rights obligations and is, from my point of view, a pretty common sense thing to do.
But it seems that we're in familiar territory in one way, because actually when she was talking before about social care, would there be a cap, wouldn't there be a cap? Oh, that was just simply the same story, just a kind of different form of language. You seem to be saying exactly the same about this, but this is clearly what she was saying tonight, is that we need to alter the law in some way to increase the possibility of either restraint or exclusion. We will look at that. Dominic Grieve, you're a lawyer. You know she was saying something different.
I perfectly understood that she wanted to review particularly the law in terms of restricting people's liberty if there was evidence which couldn't be produced in court, but was intelligence evidence. Yes, but it can be looked at further. TPIMs, which we have at the moment, could be changed or improved.
But we've only actually used 7 TPIMs at the moment. Only 7 restrictions.
Indeed, yes. And history has shown that both TPIMs and control orders may have rather a limited use. So, but that's not a reason, if I may say so, why you shouldn't go away and look at them again. That's a sensible reaction by government, and not one with which I have any difficulty.
Dominic, you're saying this 2 days out from an election. You've been on this programme many times arguing against 90 days, arguing against 42 days, arguing against control orders. You have always been one to say that the panoply of the law as it exists just now is sufficient to the task. You must be crossing your fingers and toes.
But you're not at all. I'm always one to argue against gimmicks. Absolutely. And gimmickry does creep in because people feel that they've got to do something. But in fairness to the Prime Minister, if you listen to what she had to say this evening, reviewing how TPIMs operate and seeing whether there are further measures...
She was saying amendments.
Well, amending TPIMs is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, particularly as it can be done within the framework of our human rights obligations without any real difficulty, if the situation warrants it. So I don't have a problem with that. Clearly, the detail will have to be looked at, but she's not wrong to raise such an issue.
2 days from the election.
Well, unfortunately, these events have taken place 4 days from an election. I think we have to live with the consequence of that. It's a difficult subject. You can't just ignore it and say we'll come back to it on Saturday. That's unreasonable both for the opposition and it's equally unreasonable for the government.
Thank you both very much indeed.
I've been getting away with it